Hello and welcome everyone to the Varsity Tutors StarCourse series, where winter is coming. For us humans, that may mean sweaters and coats and hot chocolate. For animals, it means a whole bunch of different things. And we have Phil Torres here, naturalist, explorer. You know him from Discovery Channel and Varsity Tutors StarCourse series, here to tell us all about the amazing ways that animals get ready for and survive through long and cold winters, or for some of them, they just avoid it entirely. Now, a couple things for you guys to know to make sure you get the most out of class. One, please keep it interactive. There's a chat box to the right of the screen. Phil's going to ask you a lot of questions to find out what you do for winter and what you think animals do for winter, and you can answer them there. Also, if you've got any questions at all throughout tonight's class, please feel to drop them there. Don't wait until the end. We're going to be monitoring that area the whole time, and I'll interview Phil toward the end with your questions so we can get you as many answers as possible. Also, make sure you've got a camera nearby, because in about a half an hour, we're going to give you a chance to lean into the screen, snap a selfie with Phil, and if you put that up on Instagram and tag Phil Torres and Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win a spot in one of our after-school clubs and a butterfly net, one of Phil's favorites, as he'll tell you is kind of the way he got into becoming an animal adventurer like he is now. So with all that said, before Phil loses the daylight behind him, because that's another thing that happens during winter, I want to turn it over to your expert instructor for today, Phil Torres.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to December. It's December 1st. That is a big deal. That means that winter is right around the corner. Now, I'm guessing where some of you live, it may have already snowed. Where some of you live, maybe you won't see snow all winter, but you're definitely noticing some changes. And some of them are out in nature, but then some of those changes are right at home. So I always like just kind of getting a sense of excitement about winter. So what are some reasons that you are excited about winter? Love seeing all the answers. Okay. Sledding. Can I just say, as an adult who skis, sledding is still way more fun. It's a blast. Snowball fights, the holidays, people saying seeing family, good food. All of those things are absolutely something to be excited about with winter. And I gotta say, it is a tough world to survive out there for animals. They don't get fireplaces and sweaters and hot cocoa, which I have right here. And by the way, if I get whipped cream on my nose, someone please let me know. But it is another cue right behind me that winter is coming. Look how dark it is. And it's 4 o'clock where I am right now in Seattle. We live in the forest. You can see there's some really big trees back there. So as the sun goes down, the forest gets darker. But what I love is that we have owls that live back there, and every once in a while we hear them call. So maybe there's a chance we will hear an owl today, and that'd be really, really exciting. So I say, let's jump into it. Today's forecast, there is a chance of snow, but there will definitely be animals that migrate, animals that hibernate, animals that tolerate, and then you as an animal, how you can appreciate. So what do you say we, jump into it? I always like figuring out what it is that you at home know, because you're pretty smart. You've been to a lot of these lessons. And I know that every time I talk to a kid about nature, they know way more than most adults do. So let's find out, what are some animals that migrate to warmer weather for winter? Let's talk about this migration. Which animals out there migrate? I know a lot of people like to migrate, escape the cold, maybe go on spring break someplace a little bit warmer, but animals do that too. And we're going to get into the why. But right now, I just want to see which ones you're saying. So birds, yes, birds migrate. Butterflies, if you went to my butterfly talk, you know that they migrate. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Whales, people forget that animals in the ocean migrate too. It's not all about avoiding getting snowed on. So if we take a look at some of these animals that migrate, we've got the monarchs, we've got birds, some surprising ones like bats. That's bats in the top right. Ladybugs. Yes, ladybugs migrate, and whales. So looking at these images, I think you can deduce, what do a lot of them have in common? Almost all of them have wings. So why is it that mostly birds and other winged animals are the ones that migrate? I want to hear from you. I mean, yes, they can fly. That is a really, really big one. Flying is much easier than walking because think of the amount of obstacles in your way. You can go from point A to point B just into the sky. But if you're in a mountain range and you're trying to migrate from one to another down south, there's a lot of obstacles that could get in your way. And there's another one too of why these animals are almost forced to migrate and definitely not hibernate. Think about the size of birds. Think about the size of animals that hibernate. Those animals that hibernate generally get pretty big over time. We're talking about you bears, but as a bird, they need to be really, really lightweight. Birds even have hollow bones in order to fly. So let's say they need to bulk up. They need to get this big, full of fats and energy in order to hibernate all winter. As they eat and they eat more and more to try to get up to that level, they may end up too big to fly. So that's not a very good adaptation for a bird to survive winter. So birds are more likely to migrate or do that third option, tolerate, which we'll get to also. But this animal adaptation, this is something we're going to be talking about a lot because they're fascinating. They're things that have been passed down from generation to generation of animal, all the ones that survive long enough in this world in order to mate. That's how evolution happens, is the survivors pass on their genes. And so some of these adaptations have happened over not just thousands of years, but millions of years as different continents change and these animals adapt to all these really unique scenarios. And a lot of them have to deal with handling the cold. So let's talk about the why. This is something that on one hand seems obvious because winter is challenging, but summer and spring is pretty nice. There's a lot of vegetation around. So there's availability of food. There's this idea of birthing young in nicer climates. And then there's this concept of ensuring the strongest survive. So this first one, availability of food, it's not just that there's more food around. It's that, see how dark it is? If you are a diurnal animal, not nocturnal, an animal that's active by day, you're going to only have 4 or 5 hours in the day in which you can see your prey and try to get food. So that's going to be tough for you to try to tough it out. So instead, you're just going to migrate to a place where there's a lot more light, a lot more vegetation for the herbivores and herbivores for the predators to eat. Then there's birthing young in nicer climates. I think of this one especially with whales, because if you are a mama whale and you have a baby, you have to produce over 100 gallons of milk per day for some of these. I think that's for the humpback whale. That is an enormous amount of energy that whale has to commit to making milk. So if they're in colder water, remember, warm-blooded animals can stay warm because of their metabolism, because they burn energy to stay warm. So if that whale were in cold waters, it's going to be burning a lot of energy just to stay warm, and not enough energy will be dedicated to actually making milk. So in that case, birthing young in nicer climates, more food, and more of the food that you eat can be dedicated to feeding your young. And then we have this concept of ensuring the strongest survive. And I kind of see this as like a side effect of migration, where migration started happening, and then the very fact that it is challenging to do, it's a very good, I guess, filter within a population of animals. And let's say you're a female and you see a male that also did this 1,000-mile journey. That's going to be a really good mate for you. You're going to have strong offspring, both physically, but also think of how mentally strong you have to be to migrate, because the food that you're going to come across in entirely new environments than where you were in the summer, or where you grew up. Some of these animals migrate from Seattle, where I am, all the way down to Central America. So they're going to come across all these different items. They have to figure out if they're edible, not to mention all different predators that are going to be going after you to try to survive. So you got to be very mentally sharp. And then it gets even beyond that, where these animals that migrate have to know the exact location. So for them to be able to migrate at all, it's worked into these species that helps the species stay really, really strong. And within migration, there are some absolutely extraordinary journeys. The monarch is my absolute favorite. For those of you that saw my butterfly lesson, I talk about it a lot because it's amazing. These butterflies, every fall, before winter hits, they will travel from as far north as Canada all the way down to the mountains of Mexico. And what's crazy here is that they're multi-generational. So we're going to talk about them. We'll talk about crazy endurance out there in migrations, and then this precision idea. But with the monarchs, what's so cool is that it is not the same butterfly that does this journey every year back and forth. It's not even that butterfly's offspring that does it every year. There are 4 or 5 generations separating each migration. So the butterfly that made it from, let's say, Ontario, Canada, down to Michoacan, Mexico, that is the great, one more great grand butterfly of last year's one that did it. And somehow this genetic information is passed down that makes their brains somehow figure out where to go, how to travel thousands of miles across the US to end up in the same spot. What I love about migration is so much of it is a mystery to scientists. So there's a lot to be solved on how they do it. The Arctic tern as a bird is pretty cool. I've seen them in Iceland. They hover above their nest, and if you get close, they'll dive at your face. So I avoided them when I could. Otherwise, they come right at you. But what's really remarkable about their migration is that they go basically from the North Pole all the way down to the South Pole. That animal, that bird, sees more of the Earth than pretty much any other species on the planet, humans included. It's remarkable. And then this precision and punctuality idea, where animals that migrate have to be pretty precise because they end up oftentimes in the exact same place that they were the year before. So how do they do that? Well, they've somehow got mental maps. Some of them can feel magnetism. Others use polarity of light to get to the same spot. But if you think about it, that means that animals that migrate, if they are so reliant on certain places, like let's say there's some birds that need a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific to migrate to from Alaska in order to have eggs. They go to the same spot every year. That definitely happens. They're at risk of habitat loss because not only are they reliant on where they came from, but that entire journey that they did, they need good habitat along that entire way. And then if they rely on something as precise as an island, if invasive rats show up there or cats get on the island, that can wipe out an entire generation. So migration is definitely, it has its advantages, but it also has its risks, especially in today's changing climate and with the risk of habitat loss. So watching migration is really fun. I'm imagining that some of you have been able to see it. If you're on the coast of California, you can sometimes see whales going right along shore. And it is so cool because they are so giant. The butterfly migration, people will sometimes in the fall, if you look sharp enough, you can see monarchs. If you take out your compass, you'll see, yep, they're flying south. But for scientists who study migration, observing it and figuring out where they go, you can't just stand and watch them go from A to B because they migrate, in some cases, hundreds or thousands of miles. So how do they figure it out? Well, with birds, what they do is they have very safe ways of catching the birds, put a little ring around their leg with an ID tag that goes to a master database so that if somebody finds that bird 1,000 miles away, so let's say you tag it in Washington, it ends up in Costa Rica, you will be able to know exactly who the previous scientist was, who saw it, where that bird came from, and you can solve this mystery of where birds migrate. With butterflies, instead of putting rings on their legs, they literally put stickers on their wings. So you catch a butterfly in Michigan, put a sticker on its wing, and if it shows up in Mexico 2 weeks later and someone happens to see it amongst the millions, which is very rare, so it took them a long time to figure it out, they are able to have that data and the identity of that same individual and figure out what journey it took. So there's that, but then there's other animals that migrate that are a little harder to see. A lot of birds fly at night. Ladybugs, yes, ladybugs migrate. How are you going to track a ladybug flying in the sky? I mean, one option, you could get a helicopter and a butterfly net. Sign me up for that. I'll try to catch something in the air, but that doesn't sound very practical. So the way they figured out how ladybugs migrate and how to see where they go and when they go, it happened on accident. It happened one winter when a storm suddenly arrived on the radar of a meteorologist. He said, is this rain? It didn't look like rain. Could it be snow? It didn't quite look like snow. You know what they figured out it was? Ladybugs. Yes, ladybugs, birds, butterflies all show up on weather radar. And now there are scientists that have dedicated their entire careers to using radar to understand how animals move across the earth, ladybugs included. I love how genius science can get. And sometimes it's accidental and they figure out, oh my gosh, this is a great way of studying the earth. For example, total tangent, but penguins, they study penguins populations with satellites. How cool is that? There's so many amazing science projects out there. So I want to talk now about what I like to call that long winter nap. Hibernation. What types of animals are the most likely to hibernate out there? Is it A, large mammals, B, small mammals, C, birds, or D, fish? What do you think? I want to see what you come up with here. This is a bit of a tricky one. I'm seeing a lot of people say A, and a lot of people I'm getting some B's in there. Some people saying birds, some fish. Well, I'm guessing many of you said A because the most classic animal that hibernates, or does it, we'll get into that later, is the bear. You know, that's the one everybody learns about. That is a large mammal. But the answer here is surprisingly B, small mammals. We'll get into why they do that. But yeah, small mammals. The bears are kind of not the norm because they technically could tolerate, maybe tough it out. So why hibernate at all? Why not migrate or, just stay active in the winter and try to eat what you can eat? Well, for one thing, food is scarce. As we talked about, there's not a lot of light to find food. If there's snow everywhere, maybe the usual thing that you would go for isn't around, and you have to use so much of your energy just to stay warm that there may not be enough food for you to be even able to, stay warm enough. And then for other animals, it is their only option. We talk about animal adaptations. Some animals adapt to specific environments. They don't go anywhere else. And so if they've adapted to a certain type of montane forest, let's say forest up in the mountains, there are some animals that will migrate. We're not just talking from continent to continent. Some of them go from higher elevation to lower elevation. I actually have some birds that just arrived for winter 3 days ago. They're called the varied thrush that come every winter here. Normally they're up in the mountains. It gets cold. They come back down. But some birds, again, those birds have wings. Some animals don't have that luxury of going from way up there to way down here or crossing state lines just to migrate. So they hibernate because there could be a lot of obstacles in their way. And you know what? It sounds pretty cozy to me, but I know all of you at home are really smart. So I love these vocab words we're going to get into that are like very, very technical, very sciencey, but I have a feeling that all of you are going to memorize it by the end, and then you can show off everything you know about winter. So hibernation, there are a few forms of it, but the main two we'll talk about here is classic hibernation. So that's a deep sleep with dramatic temperature reduction in mammals, right? And then there's torpor, which is very similar. This word is, yes, torpor. It's a weird one, but it's similar to hibernation, but it's shorter and it's involuntary. You don't always have that dramatic drop in temperature. So the great debate here, some people say bears technically hibernate Others say bears don't technically hibernate. They go through torpor. And this is a debate amongst scientists. And you would think we would have solved this by now. We've been able to monitor the biological activity of bears as they hibernate compared to where they are in the summer. But still, it is kind of a mystery, which is kind of one of my favorite things about science, is that there's things that we should figure out, but we're relying on the next generation, someone like you, to become a bear scientist and settle this great debate once and for all. Do bears hibernate, or do they go through torpor? One thing is for sure, they absolutely go dormant. They eat a lot in the fall. They're able to take advantage of the salmon runs. They eat tons of salmon or whatever they are. They eat a lot, they get big, and then they can hibernate. Another really fun vocab word I'm throwing out as a bonus, even though we're talking about winter, is what happens in summer. Animals that are in really hot and dry conditions have adapted something called estivation. So estivation is basically hibernating through really, really hot, really, really dry weather. So we have hibernation, torpor, and estivation. There's no pop quiz at the end, but it's a fun one to give a pop quiz to your friends or your parents. I love these words. And we got one more, brumation. Think of that as like sweeping a broom. This is something that reptiles and amphibians and some insects do, which is they let their body temperature get really, really cold. And to survive this, a lot of insects and reptiles and amphibians actually create their own antifreeze. They create something, these usually types of sugar molecules in their blood that keep their body from completely freezing solid, so that their organs and their blood vessels can not burst, or, you know, when ice expands in their body. But then you get one called the wood frog. The wood frog is kind of the ultimate in brumation. What it does, you can see it there. It is a icicube. It's an icicle, basically. It freezes. It absolutely turns essentially frozen solid, and then come spring, it thaws out. And there's videos out there of them just stuck in a chunk of ice. And then as it melts, they're kind of exposed, they're pretty flat. And then eventually they do this really slow wake up, and there they go. So if I were to have any animal's superpower, I mean, being the wood frog would be pretty cool, because you could just jump into a frozen lake and wake up 10 years later and you'd be fine, because you've been bruminating. It's that brumation word. So I want to talk about you as an animal, because we have to deal with winter too, and some of these similar things. So let's talk about the morning. What do you feel like first thing in the morning, and what do you do first? Okay, I'm seeing some people say, get ready for school. Yeah, try to sleep in. I'm right there with you. And breakfast. Yes. So one thing's for sure, you feel a little groggy. It takes you a while to really feel yourself, but you need breakfast. And think about, that's just us having 8 or 9 hours sleep, maybe 6 or 7 hours sleep. These animals that hibernate, they have to go through a sleep for months. So when they wake up, you know they're going to be groggy and they're going to want breakfast. So if you are a grizzly bear, oftentimes their very first meal is animals that didn't survive the winter. So remember, this bear chose to hibernate. Other animals try to tolerate. They try to tough it out. Those animals that didn't get frozen in the snow. Come springtime, their bodies thaw out, and bears get out, and their breakfast, their stack of pancakes, is animals that are defrosting in the snow. And I always love that fact, because you know, you think about it, you're going to be really groggy. You're not going to want to hunt anything. So they just go to the freezer section of nature and they grab the frozen food, whether it's an elk or a moose or something smaller. But for bears, it works. Within hibernation, I like to say nature has some of it. Within hibernation, I like to say nature has some of its greatest hits. I absolutely love some of these facts. So let's start with turtles. Turtles, if they are in a pond, top of the pond freezes over. The turtle can bruminate, so they can lower their temperature in the water. But how do they breathe? Because turtles need oxygen. Well, they can't breathe through their skin like some frogs can. Instead, you know what they breathe through? Their butts. Yep. Turtles, not just in winter, but all over the world, can breathe through their butts. It's called cloacal breathing. And I find that hilarious, but you know what? It's a hibernation survival strategy. Garter snakes essentially have the world's biggest legless slumber party. They all slither together into these little cave-like things, anywhere they can find a big hole, and either dozens up to hundreds, even thousands of them all huddled together all winter long. Now, what's really fun about this is if you happen to be at the right place at the right time in spring, you can find all hundreds of those snakes all leaving a hole right at the same time. And if you love snakes like I do, it's the best thing ever. If you are afraid of snakes, like I'm sure some people out there are, it can be a little terrifying. But remember, these are garter snakes. They're not venomous, so you're okay. Bumblebees have another really cool strategy, which is that the queen lives on. All the other ones die. It's just the queen that will live underground in her nest. So how does she build the colony back up? Well, come springtime, she first lays workers, and then she starts laying the other ones, but basically she has to keep the nest going year after year with no help. She just is the sole survivor. And then there's snails, which we all know they carry a home on their back, right? But what's also cool about them is they can create a mucus that basically caps off the front of that shell, and they can hang out, hibernate all winter long in their shell with that mucus membrane. So there's some really diverse strategies, from breathing through your butt like a turtle to making a mucus membrane like a snail. But I mean, nature's got some creativity, you could say. Now, for the final section of how to deal and take on winter, we have the animals that tolerate it, that essentially try to tough it out. So remember, you are an animal too who has to survive winter. What are some of the ways that you deal with the winter cold? I want to see some answers. What do you do when it's cold outside? I know what I do. One of the things is I drink hot cocoa. Oh, that's so good. This is another reason I love winter. It's hot cocoa season. Can't do this in the summer. And no whipped cream on the nose. Still good. Okay. So I'm seeing some of you say, sit by the fireplace, coats, blankets, scarves, all of that. Yeah. Hats, boots. It's important to bundle up in the winter, and animals do something kind of similar. No, they don't have jackets they can put on, but they have their own ways to tough it out. So why tough it out instead of hibernating or migrating to warmer weather? Well, for some animals, they can handle it. They've adapted to it. And within this term adaptation, so let me go through this scenario, and then I really want to dig into some of these terms. So there's animals that adapted to it. There's animals that can wear winter well, and then others that use it to their advantage. So these adaptations, this is that term I talked to you about, where they've evolved this over many, many generations, and it's really cool. And we oftentimes think of adaptations as just being physical adaptations. So there's animals that get a thicker fur coat, or they store a lot of fat. But some of these adaptations are also behavioral. So us, human mammal, we have a lot of behavioral adaptations to survive winter. We wear coats, we make fires, and there's other animals out there that maybe they're not putting on coats and making fires, but they also have behavioral adaptations too. Beavers, for example, they make a bigger den to be able to stay inside in a slightly warmer environment. So a lot of animals, if they can handle it, they can use winter to their advantage. Think of a bird like an owl that normally has to search really hard for prey that's completely camouflaged, or some bird of prey like a hawk. You know, if something's going along on completely white snow and that animal's dark, I think they're going to have an easier time to actually find prey than they would in the summer. So if they can handle it, they will take advantage of it. So what animals do tough it out? Well, generally, it's large animals. Without going into too many details, it has to do with the ratio of their volume to surface area. So a very small animal has a ratio of volume to surface area where they lose a lot of heat. They have a lot of surface area exposed, so it's really hard for them to tough it out and stay warm. Bigger animals, the ratio of their skin to their body, they don't lose as much heat. And think of it, big mammals, they got fur. They can get thick fur. They're wearing their own coats. And they can create their own body heat because they're warm-blooded. They're able to use metabolism, use the food and the fats that they have stored up to create their own heat. So those are generally the ones you will see. A lot of bigger animals choose to tough it out, and they have some really cool adaptations. So my favorite is the magic trick of changing color. An animal that's more brown to camouflage during the summer can turn pure white by winter. So we have rabbits that do that, Arctic fox that do that. I think lemmings do that. There's some really, really cool ways that they change color. Birds do that too. I think ptarmigans. Others will develop winter coats, so they get really thick fur. Wolves do that. Some of your dogs, you may see that there's a time of year where they really shed a lot of fur because they've had a much thicker coat. And then we get to these behavioral adaptations. So those previous two were physical. The behavioral adaptations, squirrels stockpile food. They go around, they get all these high-fat things, and they try to store them somewhere to survive and tolerate winter. And then animals like polar bears will change their hunting habits. So they actually choose to go for different prey by winter compared to by summer. It's really getting out and observing winter in action. We don't always think of wintertime as being the best time to see nature. I'm sure the trees may look beautiful covered in snow, but animals are out there. Some of them are hibernating, some left town, but others are toughing it out. So are any of you in a place where you're about to get some snow? Because I keep checking the weather report every single day about the first snow here. And it's looking like it's going to take a while this year, actually throughout most of the West. So any of you, I'm seeing some people. Canada, you'll get snow soon. New York, you guys already had snow. I am very, very jealous of that. Chicago, there's a lot of places that get winter weather in the US, and you could take advantage of what nature's doing during that time by getting outside. And what I like to do is to become a animal winter detective, because trying to find evidence of where animals have been during the summer or spring can be really tough. Maybe you'll see a little bit of hair that got caught on a branch, or you'll see some tracks in the mud. But by winter, think about it. There are tracks everywhere. So it's a really good time to study these things and see, maybe you can get a guidebook that tells you what a rabbit footprint looks like compared to a forest marten or some of these other animals. And there's one track that if you see, it's this one right here. It is such a amazing mystery, and I want you to see if you could solve it. So in the very far end, we see there's this small trail coming through, and then all of a sudden there's a big mess that happened right there. And these other kind of finger-like motions on the side. So what happened here? This is where being a biologist is really fun, because you're kind of like a detective. You get to look at this and say, I see evidence of one animal from the far direction. It doesn't look like the same animal that happened at the beginning. You know what happened here? This is something I've seen with my own eyes only once, but this is evidence of a crime. This is evidence of an owl that took out its prey. And so the prey is that small trail coming through from the reeds back there. And the owl, those finger-like prints are actually the feathers. Those are the wings that landed on the animal, and then it, took off right there. So if you see that out there, that is what I call the holy grail of winter. That is the coolest bit of nature that you can see all winter long. So I want you all to be looking for it. And there's other animals that actually could use your help in the winter, and that makes it really fun to observe. So Hummingbirds, for example, here in the Pacific Northwest, they stick around all winter long, and their population is getting bigger every winter compared to where it was 20 years ago. And they think that it has to do with the fact that a lot of people put out hummingbird food. So this is something I filmed Christmas Day a couple years ago. It was snowing out, we had Christmas lights, and there was hummingbirds around. We've even seen hummingbirds flying around in the snow. So if you live in an area like that, put out hummingbird food. It may freeze overnight, so take it in overnight, put it back out. They're going to appreciate it. And because they're so cold, they stick around a lot longer. So you can just stand next to the hummingbird feeder and watch them in action. It's really fun. Other winter birds, the same. If you have a bird feeder with seeds and stuff, you can put higher fat bird seed out there. So things like sunflower seeds, that'll keep those birds really happy as well. So there's cool ways that you can appreciate and interact with nature. Now, when it comes to the hibernating animals, I always encourage people to, get in the mud a little bit, interact with nature. That is something that really shaped me when I was young, but you also have to be really, really respectful. You have to really think about it. Is your action going to harm this animal or possibly even kill it and make it not be able to survive the winter? So what I mean by that is great way to see reptiles and amphibians and other things that may be brumating is lifting up logs, lifting up rocks. This is something that I did when I was 5. And now that I'm 35, guess what I do everywhere I go? I lift up logs and rocks, but I do it really carefully because under each one, there can be some really exciting things. You could see a wasp that looks like it's frozen solid, but it's waiting for spring. You could find salamanders. You could find a snake. So what I do is I do it really carefully and I check what's under there and then I'll put it right back. Because if you're lifting it and throwing these things everywhere, you just ruin the shelter of something. And we don't want to do that. We want to be able to observe, to appreciate the hibernators and the brumators without harming them. So I encourage you, go out there, be winter detectives, see if you could see some of these animals that we've talked about in nature. And then also when it comes to fall next year, actually in spring, watch the transition. In spring, see which animals come back and are the first to arrive from the winter migration and they're back. So that to me is one of the best things about having seasons is as a biologist, it keeps your brain going. You see these little patterns in winter and then in spring and summer, and every year is a little bit different. And it's really fun to try to use your mind and to use the tools of science to solve why. And if you think about it, climate change is definitely affecting a lot of these animals. And if they're relying on winter, they're relying on cold, and they get kind of a false start in the spring, that's not going to go well for them. So that's another thing that is definitely on the mind of people trying to study winter and animals.
Hey, Phil, thank you so much. That was, we learned about some really incredible animals there. I was going to try brumation while you were talking and then realized I'm warm-blooded, so it doesn't quite work out. There's another type of breathing I thought about trying and figured I got a job to do. I got to get back here. So thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for some amazing questions. We're going to get to those. Keep those coming because you guys have had some really insightful ones. We'll put Phil on the hot seat here in just a second. But first, I know we promised everybody an opportunity to take a selfie with Phil here in a second. If you get that up on Instagram, you'll be entered to win a butterfly net. I know Phil mentioned, sort of that the goal of just tinkering with nature is what got him interested and really to where he is now, hosting TV shows and StarCourses and all those kind of things, and a spot in Wildlife Future Club with Varsity Tutors. So hopefully you guys have your cameras ready. We'll have the official Instagram handles up in about 10 minutes or so on our way out here. So get your questions coming in, have those cameras out because we're gonna go back full screen to Phil here for about 10 seconds. Make sure everybody gets a chance to get those pictures. All right. Hopefully you guys got great pictures. If I cut you off a little bit, don't worry about it. You guys know Phil smiles when he's talking about animals, and so we will make sure we get him back full screen whenever he's answering questions. But you guys have had so many good ones. I didn't want to let those sit. One of my favorites, actually, we talked about a lot of amazing animals. There's one we didn't talk about. There's a lot we didn't talk about. Charlotte had a really good question. Do we know what worms do to prepare for winter?
Wow, I knew I was going to get some really hard questions and have to do my best to give an answer. Worms, huh? Well, my guess is they would be more in the brumator category, where they probably, they're ectothermic, they're cold-blooded, and so they would probably just completely chill if the ground is frozen, and then they probably have some antifreeze in them so they don't freeze solid, and then they'll come back out. But others, I mean, I've seen them active in fairly cold weather, 40-degree earth, they can still be pretty active. But I imagine once that earth freezes solid and it's covered with snow, you don't know. But also snow can be an insulator. So when there's snowpack over the earth, it can actually keep what's below it a little bit warmer sometimes. So I encourage you to try to dig through the soil in January. And if you see a worm, you tell me what it's doing.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for that question, Charlotte. We love getting all the tricky ones. Let's learn as much as we can here today. Talk about migration. We'll go back kind of toward the beginning. A lot of people wanted to know, when you were mentioning that, butterflies are multi-generational. It might be the great grand butterfly that finally makes it to Mexico of the one from the previous season. What happens to all those generations in between?
Well, the generations in between are just expanding their range. So for the monarch in particular, they all start down in Mexico. And then the first generation is, let's say the eggs are laid in Texas or Iowa or Alabama, somewhere in the southern US. And then the next generation expands and expands and expands. And then they're kind of all over the US. So it's not just the ones from Canada making their way all the way down south. There's also some monarchs that stick around in Texas or stick around in Colorado that also have to do that migration down. So they're basically just, they're flying, they're what you see all summer long, where they're mating, they're laying eggs, they're drinking nectar, and then that next generation will expand further north until they get those environmental cues of daylight. You can see how dark it's getting. And temperature as well is a really big cue. And that's why we talked about the idea that climate change can really affect animals that migrate, hibernate, tolerate, all of them, because these animals rely on the environment to tell them when it's time to go.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we had a lot of questions about how do they know when it's time to go or to come back or to hibernate or to wake up. And then another good one I wanted to add on top of that is how do they know which direction is south? We always know birds fly south for winter. We know that whales take that long trip from Alaska down. How do they know which direction to even head? And does it ever happen they're going the wrong way? It gets progressively colder and they screw it up. And those of us with bad sense of direction really want to know.
Again, this is one of those areas where science is still finding the answer. So as far as when they know to migrate, usually there's three things involved. One is light, the other is temperature, and then the other is food quality. Because let's say you're an herbivore and your food all of a sudden starts tasting a little bit different, the leaves are starting to change color. That's your cue that what you eat, those chemicals in there say, all right, we got to change something, let's migrate. So those are the cues that they find from the environment, the stimulus that says, let's go south. How do they know which way south is? Well, there are some animals that have a substance called, I believe it's called magnetite. Yes, it sounds like a superhero substance or something, but I think it is an iron-based molecule that can be in their brain that kind of orients like a magnet. So they're able to use that to navigate and figure out which way is south. There's others like the monarch that have internal clocks. And so that clock uses the sun's orientation, kind of like a sundial, to say, okay, what time is it? If the sun is here and it's this time of day, that means south is that direction. So they use this clock inside their brain. It's actually in one of their antennae, which is really bizarre. And then they use their eyes to figure out where the sun is. and they know which way is south. Do some get confused and go the wrong way? Yeah. But do those genes get passed on to the next generation? Remember, we talked about one of the advantages of migration is only the strongest survive. Those genes don't get passed on. So that mistake is very, very rare, because if they go north, they're going to get cold. They're probably not going to survive winter, unfortunately. And so their genes and that mistake, I guess, doesn't get passed on.
Fascinating. It all kind of ties back to these are adaptations that have been built up over, millions of years in some cases to give them those advantages. Let's move on to hibernation. One of my favorite questions we talked about, bears are a little groggy. They're all a little bit groggy in spring. They've been sleeping all so long. So eating is a challenge. We talked about how they did that. Another really good question always comes back to the bathroom. How do they deal with that? A lot of us have to wake up a couple times in a night, and they're sleeping for several months. What do we know about hibernators and the bathroom?
So what animals do is they basically shut down most of their systems. So the only system that is really going is the one that is kind of burning a little bit of energy. It's like a very small ember in a fire that's just keeping them warm. Their digestive system is basically shut down. Their urinary tract system is basically shut down, because think about it, they just spent all fall. If you think of how big bears can get, they spent a lot of time using that digestive system to get that big and store all the fats. So they may not have a lot of extra food inside them that they have to pass, and they may not have much water that they would need to pass, because they basically are trying to retain as much of it as possible. That being said, I'm sure in the spring, they may have something big that they would have to leave behind that's been in there for a while, but otherwise they basically are able to stay pretty dormant, and they just try to use everything that they got. So even excreting anything could be a detriment to their survival.
It's a really good point. We think of hibernation or brumation as a really long nap. It's a different biological process, right? It's really shutting down so many functions that that they can kind of get through the wind. They're almost turning themselves off. So some of those things don't have to happen the way we might think of it. So perfect. Thank you. Another question people have, we have a lot of people talking about where they're from and what they're seeing. And so, a lot of folks were saying, hey, where I live, maybe it's Ohio, maybe it's Washington, some of those areas, I don't see a lot of birds flying south. Like I still see a lot of birds out there. What about some of these animals that either seem to break the mold? We would think they would migrate. We would think they would hibernate, but we're still seeing them. Or does that have to do with where we live, that in our areas, maybe they don't, but elsewhere they do?
So I would say the key with birds is that most of them migrate at night. So it's really hard to see them with our eyes. So there were some nights in this fall where I believe over the state of Georgia, they calculated using radar that there was about 7 million of birds flying south over that state in one night. So it's happening. A lot of these birds are smaller. They're a little bit more unusual. They're only there for half the year. So maybe you're not as familiar with them when you see them. And then honestly, the way that our climate's changing and the artificial food sources that humans provide also changes the migration. So the Canada geese, that's that classic, you'll see hundreds of them up in the sky and that flying V. Some of them aren't migrating as much because we have golf courses, because we have ponds with grass, and we've created this perfect predator-free haven for them to get all the food that they want. So that could also be one of the reasons that they do change. But what I would do if I were you is look up migrating birds of whatever state you're in, and then you'll start to recognize them, and you can kind of study them, and you'll know, okay, in spring, I'm going to look out for these species, and maybe you'll get lucky and you'll see one.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for calling out where you were. We have people from all over and some really cold weather, but Nova Scotia was in there, Alaska, lots of folks in the mountains in Colorado and California and Washington, all kinds of places. I always love seeing Detroit's where I'm from, and it gets cold. So there's cool things to see out there. So thanks to everybody for asking those questions with your locations that, kind of study up and find what you'll be able to see. Probably brings me to my last one here, Phil. A lot of people wanted to know about you, your favorite animals, your favorite replaces all those. Let's maybe end with this one.
Okay.
What is one winter animal that you've always wanted to see? You've seen so many cool animals, places in all your travels. What is one that you've still always wanted to see in its winter habitat? If you had to pick one animal doing what it does in winter, what would you like to see and why?
Now, this is a hard question. One animal, as you guys may know, I spent a lot of my time studying insects. So I love butterflies and I love spiders and all those things. But my first love of animals was the wolf, the gray wolf. And I've seen them in the wild once during the summer in Mongolia, but I've never seen them since. And they're just such a intelligent predator that are just, they're the ones that tough it out. So I would love to see a wolf in the middle of winter. I've been planning to go to Yellowstone National Park, where they have some really nice wolf populations there, and you could see them in the winter. Would be amazing. And then my second one, I know I'm cheating. I said my first one, but the Arctic fox, because they change colors. Google image search Arctic fox, and it's really, I mean, they're just so puffy, and they change color, and they look just so magical. It's really cool.
Nice. Another tough one because they do that so they can camouflage a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's cheating too, but you've seen enough and told us enough about some incredible animals. You get to, I think we'll allow it.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all of the advice on how we can appreciate winter animals. Hopefully everybody has a great chance to do that. For all of the insight, thanks to all of you for such amazing questions. Those of us here on Team Varsity Tutors that get to monitor and track all the questions are always blown away by the insights you guys have, the great questions you ask, and all those kind of things. So keep them coming. Keep coming back for more classes. We look forward to seeing your pictures up on Instagram. That'll kind of be my cue here to make sure we get those instructions up. So huge thanks to you, Phil. Thanks to all of you out there for some truly amazing questions and interaction. Hopefully everybody is ready and excited for winter, and especially how could you not be after today's class? So huge thanks, everybody.